The government promises to put a cap on COVID patients to help the country's overwhelmed nurses, why some say it's not enough. China announces military drills in waters around Taiwan, describing it as a solemn warning. We meet the radio buff who's keeping track of every plane that Beijing sends into Taiwan's defense zone. And on a foodie mission, the women telling the stories of Taiwanese cuisine in the US. A warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yin Khvat. Taiwan's government is stepping in to help the country's nurses who say they are inundated with COVID patients and are feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. The health minister is promising to put a limit on the number of patients nurses have to look after. But nurses are skeptical the new measures will be enforced. John Van Trieste has more.
Taiwan's nurses are under pressure amid the country's worst COVID wave. Now the government is stepping in. After talks with unions on Wednesday, it set a limit of 7 COVID patients per nurse. That's higher than its original 5 patients per nurse policy. But it is a step back from the 9 to 15 patients nurses at some hospitals have been facing. Officials are also giving nurses per-patient bonuses. They're even trying to get qualified nursing assistants to help out with promises of money. The tone from the government has been conciliatory.
现在好像有一些相关的意见，那我想我秉持的一个最大的诚意，那听取大家的意见，那能够共谋解决之道，那最好。
Nurses' unions, though, aren't happy. They wonder how the government will enforce its cap, and they say offers of extra money miss the point.
多一个病人多2000块，不是我们的诉求，也不是我们要的目的。我们要的是人员能够好好休息。
Making matters worse is the fact that up to 10% of nurses in northern Taiwan alone can't work because they have COVID too. The result could be a nursing shortage, as frustrated nurses quit and aspiring nurses change their minds about the profession.
一定会有人离职啊！我们也很担心的这一波哈，我们说早期可能都是一个使命嘛，休听呐哈，但是呢，挺到久的时候也会累嘛，应届毕业生可能还不太想进来。
If things don't improve, COVID-19 could cast a shadow over Taiwan's medical system long after the pandemic itself ends. Klein Wang and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
Taiwan reported 104 COVID-19 deaths on Thursday. It was the first time that number broke 100. Reporter Rick Glowett spoke to Taipei-based computational biologist Chase Nelson about the rising COVID cases and deaths in Taiwan. He began by asking what the numbers say about the country's biggest outbreak to date.
Epidemiologists in Taiwan have projected that anywhere from as early as next week to maybe sometime in July, the cases will peak. So it's really impossible to know. However, deaths are coming up now. And in fact, deaths, the counting of them, lags about 2 to 4 weeks behind the counting of cases because it takes time for someone to test and worsen and hospitalize. And so what everyone should be aware of is that the deaths are lagging behind the cases. And what we should be doing, in my view, is to really continue to take precautions so we keep cases down. And the reason for that is to help our healthcare workers who are easily going to be overwhelmed within the coming weeks.
Could you give us a sense of what the COVID numbers don't tell us?
In a way, it's easier to quantify things that are countable, like number of PCR tests that are positive. But something those numbers don't show us are, for example, perhaps 40% of people who get infected with SARS-CoV-2 may be asymptomatic, that is, they don't have symptoms and probably won't test. So we're not seeing those numbers in terms of cases. We're not yet seeing the deaths that could result from the cases that are being reported now, because it will take time for those to be reported. But there's also, and I think this is very important, a whole host of issues that cannot be quantified. And that includes people who get long COVID, people who will perhaps be reinfected by the next variant, like BA4 or 5 subvariants of Omicron. We're not seeing those numbers. We're not seeing numbers that tell us anything about the overwhelmed and exhausted healthcare workers.
What evidence are you seeing that Taiwanese people are adjusting their behaviors in light of this most recent outbreak.
This is a very encouraging topic because by and large, it appears from Google mobility data that Taiwanese residents have largely taken matters into their own hands when it comes to restricting their activities and limiting viral spread. So transit station mobility, buses, subways, look to be down by about 50%. And things like parks and recreation and retail are down by about a third. So I think people have been really responsible to take matters into their own hands, despite the lack of additional restrictions from the government. And no doubt that is part of the reason, not the whole reason, but part of the reason why cases have not spiked as quickly as I and some others feared.
Taiwan's defense ministry says it's keeping an eye on China's military activity near the country. That's after Beijing announced it is conducting drills in the waters around Taiwan.
中共最近对我们动作几乎没有停过了，不管在东部在北端这都是我们国军应该要平常要监控的范围，我们来持续来掌握。
China has not made it clear whether the drills have already taken place or are scheduled for a future date. It's describing the exercises as a, quote, solemn warning against recent collusion between the United States and Taiwan. US President Joe Biden has just wrapped up his first Asia tour. During the trip, he said Washington was willing to use force to defend Taiwan. That drew a furious response from Beijing. The White House later clarified that there had been no change in the US policy of strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan. To find out more about the impact of Biden's Asia trip, our reporter James Chater spoke to Robert Wang, a senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He began by asking about his main takeaways from the trip.
I think the most significant takeaway from his visit, obviously, is the intent of the United States to send a message to Asia, to the world, and to China as well, of course, that although the U.S. is busy trying to handle the crisis in Ukraine, other issues, that it is still very much engaged and focused on the challenges that the U.S. would face in Asia.
How do you view Biden's comments on defending Taiwan?
Has always been essentially to maintain peace and stability in the region. And so as China or other countries begin to act in a way that endangers the peace and stability, the U.S. responds. And in that sense, I think what Biden said in Tokyo regarding Taiwan simply responds to the aggressiveness, increasing aggressiveness of China, and is trying to, is an effort to try to deter and discourage China from continuing to do so. So I don't think it's a mishap. Of course, if it's a mishap, it's been done 3 times by the president. But no, I don't think it's a mishap, and I don't think it's a change in policy.
And there were some saying that Biden's comments almost overshadowed a more glaring point, and that's Taiwan's absence from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. How significant is Taiwan's absence from this quite significant economic agreement?
A lot of people have noticed, and certainly Taiwan has noticed, the fact that it's not on the list of those 12 partner countries. And so symbolically, I think it's quite important. But I don't see that as being very significant because, as Sullivan said, we will then work bilaterally with Taiwan to make sure that we, you might say, cover the issues that are going to be covered perhaps in the framework. And that we're going to maybe eventually, this is an initial list, that maybe later on, after we start initiatives within this particular program, other countries, other economies can join once the actual concrete initiatives are made.
What do you think the central ways in which the war in Ukraine has changed the geopolitical landscape in Asia? And could you elaborate on the ways in which you think those changes were manifested in Biden's trip to Asia?
What happened in Ukraine and Russia is probably the result of perhaps not having done things earlier to discourage Russia from doing so. So I think the lesson for the US and what Biden is doing in Asia is precisely that. The statement about Taiwan, defending Taiwan, and meeting with the Quad in Tokyo, the statement they issued, all of that, I think, you might say, benefits from the lessons that we learned in Ukraine, which is that you need to be firmer up front rather than wait until there's an invasion before you act, because what you do now will affect what happens later on in terms of future developments. So I think that's the key lesson. And
China has been sending an increasing number of warplanes into the skies around Taiwan. It's a tactic of intimidation, described by Taiwan's military as grey zone warfare. One radio enthusiast is keeping a close watch on these activities. Rick Glowett reports.
Taiwanese radio enthusiast Robin Xu listens in on warnings from Taiwan's Air Force to Chinese warplanes approaching the island. China, which claims Taiwan as its own and has upped threats to take by force, increasingly flies planes into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, a security buffer area which extends beyond the country's territorial airspace.
从早上到现在，大概有5次的广播，目前从系统上面有看到的是有一架无人机也进来了，然后有运八的远干机，还有运八的反潜机，那这些基本上都是来收集这些电子资料的。
For more than 2 years, the former Navy radar operator has been monitoring and tracking Taiwan's southern skies. With help from flight tracker apps and 12 radio reception points he set up with his friends on hills across Taiwan. Xu has counted 317 Taiwan warnings to Chinese airplanes from the start of the year to early May. That's 3% more than the same period last year. He releases the recordings on a Facebook page and shares them with local media.
之前我们的政府一直在骗我们说两岸是和平。那么，当我发现到共机越来越常进入我们的 ADIZ 的时候，这怎么能解释成和平呢？好，所以我就跟地方这边的媒体，我们把它披露出来。
Taiwan's military says the flights are grey zone warfare tactics designed to wear down Taiwan's air defenses.
我们在吃饭的时候，桌上有一盘肉，那苍蝇在它这边飞来飞去，我们只能挥手去赶它，我们没有办法把它拍死在桌上。好，就是这个道理。那现在我们国军在驱离共军，也就是属于一种像赶苍蝇的这个动作。
China's war of attrition on Taiwan shows no sign of abating, and as the tension increases, Xu now plans to expand his operations to the northern part of the island and give a fuller picture of what's happening in Taiwan's sensitive skies. Patrick Chen and Rick Glowett for TaiwanPlus.
China's foreign minister has arrived in the Solomon Islands 1 month after China signed a security pact draft with the nation during the ire of the US, Australia and New Zealand. Wang Yi's visit is part of a 10-day trip to 8 Pacific nations. He is set to sign a number of agreements with the Solomons, including the controversial security agreement. There are fears the deal could allow China to establish a military base in the islands. The Solomon Islands cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan in 2019. Taiwan says it is closely observing China's actions in the Pacific.
中国在世界各地推动“一带一路”政策多年，已经导致像斯里兰卡等国的深陷在债务陷阱，经济社会发展也出现重大危机。近期中国政府的军事战略扩张的野心呢，也已经造成太平洋区域的紧张局势升高。中国与所罗门群岛签署的安全合作架构协定呢，就是一个明显的例子。
Coming up, the art of Baja Jiang, we meet a man who has dedicated his life to one of Taiwan's oldest customs. Back in a moment.
We're just leaving the harbor. We're going to start putting in the ghost money. This is an offering to the ghost gods to make sure that we have a safe trip. We're now about 30 nautical miles off the coast of Taiwan. The waves are still pretty big. I'm not the most happy fisherman right now.
Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has met with China's leader Xi Jinping in an online meeting.
I have been committed to undertaking this visit, the first visit by a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to China in 17 years, because for me, it is a priority to engage with the government of China directly, to see how we can collaborate on human rights issues domestically, regional, and global, for development, peace and security to be sustainable, locally and across borders. Human rights have to be at the core.
The video call came on the second day of Bachelet's controversial six-day tour of the country. Rights groups say they are concerned that Beijing will use the trip to whitewash its rights record. The tour includes 2 stops in Xinjiang, where China has been accused of committing genocide. The UN estimates that Beijing has detained over 1 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in internment camps in Xinjiang. The United States' deadliest school shooting in 10 years has prompted renewed calls for stricter gun controls in the country.
Shooting is right now, and you are doing nothing.
Interrupting a news conference on Wednesday, Democratic candidate for Texas, Governor Beto O'Rourke, accused the Republican incumbent, Greg Abbott, of inaction on gun violence. An 18-year-old gunman opened fire at an elementary school in the Texan city of Uvalde on Tuesday, killing 19 children and 2 teachers. The shooter, who was killed by police, posted his plans on Facebook minutes before the attack. President Joe Biden has called on Congress to pass stricter gun control measures in the wake of the shooting. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has been officially declared the next president of the Philippines. Marcos Jr., known as Bongbong, won nearly 60% of the vote in this month's election. That's more than double the amount of his closest rival. The landslide win follows a controversial campaign marked by accusations of disinformation. The president-elect is the son of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the Philippines for 20 years before he was deposed in 1986. There's a lack of good quality Taiwanese ingredients in America. In some parts of the United States, people have to drive for hours just to find a Taiwanese grocery store. But a small team of Taiwanese Americans are on a mission to change that and at the same time promote Taiwanese culture. Bing Wang has more.
Taiwanese ingredients like this soy sauce, handmade by the Shea family in central Taiwan, are difficult to find in the United States. But Taiwanese American entrepreneurs Lisa Cheng Smith and Lillian Lin are working to make such products more accessible. In 2019, their friends set up Yin Khvat Pantry, an online shop selling premium Taiwanese food products in the U.S.
But the ones that we carry are smaller, made in smaller batches, so that allows some of the vendors to maybe put more care and thought into the products that they make. So for example, in the soy sauce, every bottle is like a baby for them, and that allows it to have maybe a more complex flavor profile.
Food is a big aspect of Taiwanese culture, one that is often conflated in the U.S. with being from China. There are over 5 million Chinese Americans, and since there's no box to check on the U.S. Census for Taiwanese Americans, it's difficult to find an official figure for that community. But through its products, Yin Khvat Pantry is working to raise awareness in the U.S. of a distinct Taiwanese culture.
In the U.S., we're creating like the identity for, a runway for the identity of Taiwanese lifestyle products. People have been associating with China for so long, and only now is okay, there's a different identity for Taiwanese lifestyle products.
And vital to these projects are the stories of the people who make them. The team behind Yin Khvat worked closely with Taiwan's small farmers, even launching a fundraising campaign for them last year when they suffered losses over a ban imposed on their products by China.
It's very much about trying to invest in, Taiwanese agriculture and to work with agriculturalists who, care about what they're doing and are trying to do things. I mean, the right way will be different for everyone, but, who have like a set of values and are, working on, developing agriculture in Taiwan in a good direction.
All their efforts will soon culminate into a physical store in New York City. The Yin Khvat team hoped for Taiwanese Americans to get a taste of home and for others in the U.S. to better understand the culture of Taiwan. Kama Xu and Bing Wang for TaiwanPlus.
The traditional folk culture of Baja Jiang, or the 8 generals, is one of Taiwan's oldest customs. Performers take on the roles of these generals, who are the lords of the underworld, by wearing elaborate costumes and intimidating face paint. Join us as we travel to the southern city of Jiang to meet a man who has dedicated his life to this special art form.
阮这是嘉义市的过沟啊，真油肠。家将的成员是地府千岁的家政的部长。所有内底你看会到这幕头前有刑具爷，伊个看过来文武车爷，过来甘柳将军、下番将军、四鬼大神。 因的职务是家政先锋。我叫陈威良，今年46岁，上19岁出来画面了后，我就对爸爸同厝，帮伊斗3工制作这头盔，制作到今仔为止，将近要30年啊。以前的头盔所做的材料是用牛皮纸，今仔现代。 咱用迄个强化帮你做，所以讲较早甲即摆的差别吼，伊的纸质材质，甲现代材料拢加做用的。然后咱即摆物件就愈做愈轻，轻到尾啊，滴的有滴，甲无滴，真差小可尔。做头盔的过程吼，第一，今仔日咱纸板啊摕出来，先甲描起来了，吼，用叉仔刀来雕刻，刻出来伊的形，用雕刻刀啊，伊咧雕刻，伊的速度袂足紧的。 准度咱爱抓较足准的，袂使叫走的。凹圆线这是咱纯粹拢爱靠咱的手工来凹，伊无再用机器来代替，所以讲这爱按部就班，看我做，看我凹，才会当凹水。当然赶工课的时阵，人去你甲咱吹毛啊要爱，咱你凹当然凹向的话，镜头啊、指甲拢会疼，拢会碰拍。实在讲的，赶毛啊要赶足紧的。 实在赶袂紧，按线凹好，咱加上咱的发条、镜啊，了后再来上水加，甲拍表面的底漆，过来咱就是爱电粉线，过来就是喷漆、上黄漆，现代的漆料愈来愈先进，所以讲会愈做愈水，工愈做愈油。咱按金的过程，尤其啊天气热的时阵，你搭金箔啊。 袂使有沙风含喘气，你都伤大就袂使，会比金箔较肥。啊，伊的珠啊，较早咱是用亚克力珠，即马豆豆渐渐就是改做施华洛的珠啊，所以讲会愈做效果珠啊愈水。后一个步骤就是会使开始来甲组起来，一项一项甲斗起来了后，过来甲斗起伊的模桶，模桶完成了后，所有的配件拢做好。 了后来斗起咱的量球，所以讲毋是1工2工就当完成的，上少伊爱经过差不多1个月时间，才有法度简单做一顶帽啊的效果出来。
Flashy cars are always eye-catching, but how much cooler is a paint job done by a robot? The latest technology developed by the auto industry uses robots to transfer artwork onto vehicles. Wei Zhonglu has the details.
This robot is reproducing abstract art on a car with zero waste. The technology is called pixel paint. Using a paint head with 1,000 nozzles, the system tracks closely to the vehicle's body, keeping paint mist from escaping into the air.
With existing solutions, only about 70% of paint ends up in the car. wasting significant resources. And that's before you even consider personalized options. Pixel paint is a faster, more efficient, and more flexible solution that streamlines personalization of manufacturing.
This particular painting was originally created by Advet Kalakar, a renowned child abstract artist from India. For young Advet, who gets his inspiration from artificial intelligence and robotics, this is like a dream come true.
It was such an incredible feeling. Initially, I could not believe a robot was painting an artwork, first time ever, and it wasn't just any artwork, it was my artwork.
Looking to stand out in an increasingly competitive market, car manufacturers are now focusing on customization.
This is another opportunity to add margin to the overall car. And it won't be a cheap one, but it'll be accessible. And I'm sure it'll be something that economically will be extremely viable.
The system, which can paint a pattern on a car in less than 30 minutes, is now on trial with major European car makers, hoping to bring personalization to the mass market. Weijun Lu for TaiwanPlus.
Thank you for watching TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yin Khvat. Finally today, we leave you with images of Peru's crazy car contest. All the vehicles are made from recycled materials, including a Batmobile and a Super Mario car. For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, please download the TaiwanPlus app. Stay safe and see you next time.